The second objection that Lee and George address is the non-intentional killing objection, or the bodily rights argument. The non-intentional killing objection makes two claims to support the conclusion that abortion is not a case of intentional killing. First, embryonic human beings may have the right to life. And second, embryonic human beings having the right to life does not entail that they have the further right to use their mother's body for life support. Therefore, abortion is not a case of intentional killing, but instead a case of denying assistance or of eviction. As Lee and George explain, proponents of the non-intentional killing objection have drawn various analogies in its defense. For example, some proponents argue that abortion is like refusing to donate your organs or refusing to let someone else use your kidneys. We are not morally obligated to donate our organs or let someone else use our kidneys, even when this assistance would place ourselves in no danger and its denial would be fatal to the other person. In the same way, proponents of the non-intentional killing objection argue that, in the case of abortion, women are not morally obligated to assist fetuses by allowing them to use their bodies. Lee and George explain that some object to these analogies because, whereas one does not have a special responsibility to donate their organs or allow others to use their kidneys, a mother has a special responsibility to her child. Proponents of the non-intentional killing objection respond, however, that a woman does not have a special responsibility to the child. The reason is because the mother has not voluntarily assumed the responsibility for the child or committed to a personal relationship with the child. And, they argue, a mother only has a special responsibility to her child if she consents to the pregnancy or commits to a personal relationship to the child. In response to the non-intentional killing objection, Lee and George raise several points. First, Lee and George initially admit that there are some abortions that are unintentional killings. The choice is to expel a human being, resulting in the unintended yet foreseen and accepted consequence of the human being's death. However, Lee and George point out that these abortions represent a minority. The vast majority of abortions are cases of intentional killing because their purpose is to help someone avoid parenthood, and the abortion would be considered unsuccessful if the human being survives. Therefore, Lee and George conclude that, quote, even if the bodily rights argument succeeded, it would justify only a small percentage of abortions, end quote. Second, some abortions are unintentional killings because they are performed only for the purpose of ending the condition of pregnancy. For example, an actress, in the interest of keeping a slim figure for a scene, may have an abortion only to end her state of pregnancy and would not object to the child's survival. This case, Lee and George concede, represents one of those rare instances when an abortion is an unintentional killing. Third, the bodily autonomy argument is misleading because it characterizes abortions that are unintentional killings as merely choosing to withhold bodily life support. Abortion, Lee and George argue, is not a decision to forego helping someone, but the decision to actively do something and thereby hurt, albeit unintentionally, someone else. In Lee and George's view, a significant moral difference exists between withholding something that unintentionally results in harm and actively inflicting harm, with the latter being much harder to justify than the former. Lee and George now begin evaluating the justification for the bodily rights argument by considering whether causing death as a side effect is ever morally permissible. Lee and George argue that there are situations where causing death as a side effect is morally permissible by providing examples. It can be morally permissible to defend your family or country from a potentially lethal attack with force you know will result in the attacker's death. Similarly, Lee and George argue it can be morally permissible to knowingly cause the death of a child in utero as a side effect. Removing a pregnant woman's cancerous uterus with her baby in it to save the mother's life can be morally permissible, even though this procedure leads to the unintended side effect of the baby's death. Having provided some situations where causing death as a side effect is morally permissible, Lee and George provide some situations where causing death as a side effect is clearly not morally permissible. A man would act immorally, argue Lee and George, if he chose to continue smoking, despite knowing that his decision would lead to the death of his daughter, who has a serious respiratory disease. Likewise, Lee and George argue that a man who works in a city with polluted air would act immorally if, by refusing to move, he placed his child who has serious respiratory problems in mortal danger. From these situations, Lee and George derive a principle regarding when causing death as a side effect is not morally permissible. This principle states that A, a parent has a special responsibility to their child, and B, this special responsibility, quote, requires that parents at least refrain from performing acts that cause terrible harms to their children in order to avoid significantly lesser harms to themselves, end quote. However, Lee and George point out, abortions that are unintentional killings, but not the correction of life-threatening pathologies, violate this principle and thus are not morally permissible. In support of Part A of the principle applying to abortions that are unintentional killings, Lee and George argue that the biologically based parental relationship of mothers and fathers to their children is sufficient for mothers and fathers to have a special responsibility to their children. But proponents of the bodily rights argument object to Part A of Lee and George's principle applying to abortions that are unintentional killings. They argue that parents have a special responsibility to their children only if they voluntarily assume that responsibility by 1, accepting the pregnancy, or 2, voluntarily developing a deep personal relationship with the child. That is, the child does not have a right to care from its parents unless its parents voluntarily assume the special responsibility to take care of it. Responding to this objection, Lee and George argue, through a counterexample, that parents may have special responsibilities to their children without voluntarily assuming such responsibilities. The counterexample Lee and George propose involves two parents who take home their newborn only because they had no alternative. The mother did not have an abortion either because the couple could not afford one, or because the option of abortion is not available in their society, and the adoption process was not quick enough to allow them to immediately give up the baby. Knowing that the baby would be returned to them if found, the parents consider abandoning the child in the woods. In this counterexample, the reluctant parents have neither voluntarily assumed a special responsibility to the child, nor consented to a personal relationship with the child. But, Lee and George argue, it would clearly be immoral for the parents to abandon the child in the woods, causing the child's death as a side effect. To sustain this response, Lee and George contrast the underlying assumption of the bodily rights argument with the underlying assumption of their own argument. In their view, the bodily rights argument assumes that we have a fundamental right to construct our life simply as we see fit. Under this view, we may have or may come to have obligations to others in one of two ways. First, we may have some very minimal obligations to others without our consent. Or second, we may acquire obligations to others through at least tacit consent to a certain sort of relationship. In contrast, Lee and George argue that we are fundamentally social beings and members of communities. According to this view, we are not free to construct our lives simply as we see fit because we must, as a basic ethical principle, quote, act for our genuine good or flourishing, end quote. And our genuine good or flourishing largely depends on the good or flourishing of those with whom we are in communion. This establishes the variety of duties or responsibilities we have with other members of our communities, even if membership precedes our consent, such as in the case of our physical or social relationships. Importantly, Lee and George clarify that their view does not require us to neglect our own good and flourishing. Rather, we ought to pursue our own good or flourishing, recognizing that our own good or flourishing is both tied up with the good or flourishing of our communities and may require us to act in ways that are uncomfortable or painful for us. To illustrate this contrast, Lee and George invite us to imagine a father who wants to spend hours reading and writing in order to cultivate his writing skills, or desires to spend hours on the baseball diamond in order to develop his athletic abilities. However, if he must spend hours at a job for adequate pay to care for his child, it is his rightful duty to forego his desires to cultivate his abilities and instead care for his child. Similarly, if this was a person who impregnated his girlfriend, he may be morally required to keep his job in order to care for her and his future child, still foregoing his desires to cultivate his abilities. That is to say, according to Lee and George, though we are fundamentally social beings who are members of the human community, our general duties or responsibilities to others are specified by those who are close to us and in need. As a result, we have duties or responsibilities to others, not only through consensual contracts and relationships, but also through various types of unions, such as with parents or siblings. Lee and George then highlight the union between parents and their children as a special relationship. In their view, because the individual as well as the united bodies of the parents bring the child into existence, and the child is a sort of prolongation or continuation of its parents, quote, there is a natural unity of the mother with her child, and a natural unity of the father with his child, end quote. Given that we have special responsibilities to those close to us, and that there is a natural unity between parents and their children, Lee and George conclude that parents have a special responsibility to their children, which precedes voluntarily assumed responsibility or consensual relationship. In support of Part B of the principle applying to abortions that are unintentional killings, Lee and George argue that the harm caused to the child, death, is much worse than the harm avoided, difficulties in pregnancy. Lee and George acknowledge that pregnancy, though involving many considerable difficulties, is in a different and lesser category than death. Citing McDonough, Lee and George acknowledge that the difficulties of pregnancy may include physical difficulties, pain during labor, significant financial costs, psychological burdens, and interference with personal autonomy. However, they argue that, in the case of normal pregnancy, these difficulties are not only less severe, but of a lesser category than death. For the harms of death, unlike those of pregnancy, are total and irreversible. Proponents of the bodily rights argument have argued, however, that pregnancy involves a unique type of burden. They argue that an intimate relationship exists between a mother and her fetus such that, if the mother is forbidden from having an abortion, this forced intimacy is analogous to rape. Lee and George respond by claiming this argument is founded on a false analogy. Though an unwanted pregnancy may cause harm to the mother, the baby cannot be construed as committing any injustice against the mother. While the child is naturally developing in the womb, the rapist forcefully and intimately violates the woman. In conclusion, Robert George and Patrick Lee summarize their arguments as follows. Being a parent generates a special responsibility to the child. This special responsibility, quote, requires that parents at least refrain from performing acts that cause terrible harms to their children in order to avoid significantly lesser harms to themselves, end quote. For the mother, this means assuming the physical burden of carrying the baby for all its distinctness, because normal pregnancy is significantly less burdensome than the harm the baby would suffer by being expelled. For the father, this means assuming the financial burden of providing for the mother and the child for months, or perhaps even years, because limiting his own freedom is less burdensome than the harm the baby would suffer by being expelled. Therefore, Lee and George write, quote, it follows that intentional abortion, even in the few cases where the baby's death is an unintended but foreseen side effect, is unjust and therefore objectively immoral, end quote.